You are my enemy from here on in for the rest of your mediocre existence.
In the wild world of punk rock, few figures were as controversial and outspoken as Johnny Rotten, the lead singer of the Sex Pistols. Born John Lydon, he became famous not just for his music, but for his harsh criticism of other musicians and his refusal to compromise his punk ideals. Throughout his career, Rotten made enemies with his sharp tongue and unfiltered opinions about what rock music should be. Rotten believed that punk rock was supposed to be dangerous and real. He thought music should challenge society and make people uncomfortable, not just entertain them. This belief put him at odds with many successful musicians who he felt had sold out or lost their edge. His famous quote, "I never lie because I don't fear anyone," showed his willingness to speak his mind, no matter who it offended. The Sex Pistols burst onto the music scene in the 1970s with songs like Anarchy in the UK and God Save the Queen. These weren't just songs, they were attacks on British society and the music industry itself. Rotten saw his band as genuine rebels who lived the harsh reality they sang about, unlike other rock stars who he believed were just playing at being dangerous while living comfortable lives. The Rolling Stones and Mick Jagger. One of Rotten's biggest targets was Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones. By the late 1970s, the Stones had been around for over a decade and were extremely wealthy and successful. To Rotten, this made them everything that was wrong with rock music. He believed they had started as genuine rebels, but had become rich entertainers who no longer posed any real threat to society. Rotten was particularly harsh about the Rolling Stones' age and their attempts to maintain a rebellious image. He reportedly called Jagger a pensioner playing dress-up and said the singer had forgotten what real danger felt like. According to music journalist Giovanni Domo, Rotten believed the Stones' continued success showed that audiences preferred safe, nostalgic rebellion over the genuine article. The conflict wasn't just about age, it was about authenticity. While the Sex Pistols were creating music that genuinely threatened the social order, Rotten saw the Rolling Stones as performing museum pieces for middle-aged fans who wanted to feel rebellious without taking any real risks. He believed their concerts were for tourists who wanted to remember their youth without confronting the uncomfortable realities of the present. At one London venue, witnesses reported that Rotten openly mocked Jagger's performance, shouting insults about the aging rock star trying to remember how to move while counting his money. For Rotten, the Rolling Stones represented everything punk was fighting against: established rock stars who had become part of the system they once rebelled against. David Bowie and artistic pretension. David Bowie was another major target of Rotten's criticism, though for different reasons than the Rolling Stones. Bowie was known for constantly changing his image and creating different characters or personas throughout his career. While many critics praised this as artistic innovation, Rotten saw it as fake and calculated. Rotten's problem with Bowie wasn't necessarily about selling out, but about what he saw as pretentious artiness that had nothing to do with real emotion or authentic expression. According to former music writer Barry Kane, Rotten told other punk musicians that Bowie was just a privileged actor who changed his look whenever his current character stopped making money. The clash represented a fundamental disagreement about what rock music should be. Bowie came from an art school background and created elaborate theatrical performances that were often praised by intellectuals and critics. Rotten, coming from a working-class background, believed this was exactly the kind of sophisticated nonsense that punk needed to destroy. Rotten reportedly told Zigzag magazine that authentic artists didn't need makeup tutorials to find their voice. He believed that Bowie's constant costume changes and character switches were just ways to hide his real self, while true artistic power came from showing your actual face and expressing genuine emotions. The animosity reached its peak when both musicians were discussed as examples of British musical innovation. At a recording industry conference, Rotten reportedly dismissed Bowie's influence by saying that art school graduates playing aliens didn't threaten anyone except their hairdressers. This comment perfectly captured Rotten's belief that Bowie's elaborate personas were more about image than substance. Rod Stewart and false working-class identity. Rod Stewart presented a different kind of target for Rotten's anger. Stewart had built his career partly on his image as a working-class hero, someone who understood and represented ordinary people's struggles. However, by the late 1970s, Stewart was extremely wealthy and living a luxury lifestyle that seemed to contradict his man-of-the-people image. This contradiction infuriated Rotten, who saw it as dishonest. According to music journalist Alan Jones, Rotten privately told punk club regulars that Stewart was a sellout millionaire who was pretending to remember his roots. Rotten believed Stewart's continued popularity showed that audiences couldn't tell the difference between genuine working-class voices and manufactured nostalgia. What made this particular? Galling to Rotten was that while Stewart was singing about ordinary people's struggles, he was living in mansions and dating models. Meanwhile, the Sex Pistols were actually living in council flats and experiencing real economic hardship. Rotten saw Stewart's act as what he called poverty tourism, performing struggle for wealthy audiences who wanted to feel connected to hardship without actually experiencing it. Rotten reportedly told Sniff and Glue fanzine that real working-class heroes don't own football teams, directly attacking Stewart's lavish spending. He believed that authentic voices stayed connected to their communities instead of abandoning them for celebrity lifestyles. The rivalry escalated at various venues where Rotten would openly challenge Stewart's credibility, reportedly yelling at him to stop singing about the streets when his biggest worry was which yacht to take on vacation. Elton John and manufactured glamour. Elton John represented yet another type of musician that Rotten despised, the entertainer who prioritized spectacle over substance. John's elaborate costumes, theatrical performances, and stadium shows were exactly the kind of manufactured glamour that punk was supposed to destroy. Rotten's problem with Elton John wasn't necessarily personal, but philosophical. He believed that John represented rock music's transformation into vapid entertainment that distracted people from real issues rather than challenging them to think. According to former Cream journalist Lester Bangs, Rotten told punk venue regulars that Elton was a Vegas showman who had forgotten that music should challenge people, not just entertain their grandmothers. The fundamental disagreement was about rock music's purpose. Rotten believed real rock should make people uncomfortable and force them to confront difficult truths about society. Elton John's crowd-pleasing approach, with its emphasis on spectacle and sing-along anthems, represented everything wrong with mainstream rock music. Rotten reportedly told Punk Live's fanzine that some performers think bigger costumes make better music, but real artistic power comes from truth-telling, not from distracting audiences with feathers and sequins while avoiding every difficult subject. He saw Elton's elaborate productions as circus acts that pretended to be dangerous while actually selling comfort food to people who were afraid of real emotions. At a London television studio, witnesses reported that Rotten openly mocked Elton's performance style, calling him a circus act pretending to be dangerous. This criticism reflected Rotten's broader belief that mainstream rock had become too safe and comfortable, more concerned with entertaining than challenging its audience. Paul McCartney and the Beatles. Perhaps Rotten's most controversial target was Paul McCartney and the Beatles, who were widely considered sacred figures in British popular music. Attacking the Beatles was seen as almost blasphemous in British culture, but for Rotten, their legendary status was exactly the problem. Rotten's war against the Beatles wasn't just about the music, it was about what they represented. He believed their continued veneration was preventing British culture from moving forward and confronting contemporary problems. According to former NME writer Nick Kent, Rotten publicly declared that McCartney was selling yesterday's dreams to people who were afraid of today's reality. The Beatles' legacy, in Rotten's view, had become a stranglehold on British musical imagination that prevented genuine innovation. While the Sex Pistols were creating music that reflected current urban decay and economic collapse, the Beatles were still being celebrated for what Rotten called flower power fantasies that had distracted previous generations from taking real political action. Rotten believed that the Beatles' message of peace and love is not just outdated but actively harmful, giving people false hope instead of encouraging them to fight against systematic oppression. He reportedly told Punk magazine that yesterday's heroes had become today's problems, and that some musicians were remembered for making people feel good instead of making them think clearly. The attack on the Beatles represented Punk's most audacious assault on established rock mythology. In a televised interview, Rotten reportedly dismissed the Beatles' entire catalog as irrelevant garbage for people who preferred dreaming about the past to fighting for the future. This statement shocked many people who considered the Beatles beyond criticism, but it perfectly captured Rotten's belief that reverence for past achievements was holding back cultural progress. Sid Vicious, the ultimate betrayal. The most painful conflict for Rotten was with his own bandmate, Sid Vicious. Vicious joined the Sex Pistols as a bassist despite having limited musical ability, and his relationship with Rotten gradually deteriorated as Vicious became more interested in the punk image than its underlying message. According to Sex Pistols manager Malcolm McLaren, Rotten privately told friends that Vicious was a walking cartoon who had confused being punk with being stupid. This was particularly frustrating for Rotten because he saw Vicious's behavior as destroying the band's credibility as serious cultural critics and turning them into mere shock value entertainers. The situation became tragic when Vicious's drug addiction and violent behavior began to overshadow the Sex Pistols' musical message. Rotten felt that his closest ally had transformed their revolutionary movement into a cautionary tale about the dangers of confusing authentic rebellion with self-destructive performance art. This betrayal was different from Rotten's conflicts with other musicians because it was personal and represented the corruption of punk from within. While Rotten could dismiss the Rolling Stones or David Bowie as outsiders who didn't understand punk, Vicious was supposed to be part of the movement. His descent into addiction and violence represented everything that could go wrong when punk's message of rebellion was misunderstood or taken to destructive extremes. The conflict with Vicious showed the tragic side of Rotten's uncompromising nature. While his criticism of established rock stars could be seen as necessary cultural criticism, his inability to help his friend and bandmate revealed the limitations of his approach. Vicious's self-destruction became a symbol of punk's potential for both liberation and devastation. The philosophy behind the feuds. All of these conflicts reflected Rotten's broader philosophy about what music should be and do. He believed that rock music had become too comfortable, too safe, and too removed from the real struggles of ordinary people. His attacks on other musicians weren't just personal, they were part of a larger cultural war about authenticity, purpose, and the responsibility of artists. Rotten's punk ideology demanded that music should be dangerous, uncomfortable, and truthful. It should challenge authority, expose hypocrisy, and force people to confront difficult realities. Any musician who prioritized commercial success, artistic pretension, or entertainment value over these goals was, in Rotten's view, part of the problem. This uncompromising stance made Rotten many enemies, but it also established him as one of the most important cultural critics of his generation. His willingness to attack sacred cows and challenge established hierarchies helped create space for new kinds of musical expression and cultural criticism. Whether one agrees with Rotten's harsh judgments or not, his conflicts with other musicians revealed important tensions within rock music and popular culture more broadly. His feuds highlighted questions about authenticity, commercialization, and the relationship between art and social change that remain relevant today. The tragic irony is that while Rotten succeeded in challenging the musical establishment, he couldn't prevent punk itself from becoming commercialized and mythologized in many of the same ways he had criticized in other genres. His conflict with Sid Vicious showed that even the most uncompromising cultural movements could be corrupted from within. Legacy of conflict. Johnny Rotten's musical feuds were more than just celebrity gossip or punk posturing. They represented a serious attempt to define what rock music should be in an era of increasing commercialization and cultural complacency. His willingness to attack anyone he saw as compromising these principles, regardless of their status or popularity, established him as one of the most uncompromising cultural critics of his time. These conflicts also revealed the challenges of maintaining authentic rebellion in a commercial entertainment industry. Rotten's criticism of other musicians often focused on how success had changed them, how wealth had separated them from their original messages, or how they had prioritized entertainment over challenge. Yet these same pressures would eventually affect punk rock itself, showing how difficult it is to maintain revolutionary purity in any cultural movement. The feuds ultimately demonstrated both the power and limitations of Rotten's approach. His brutal honesty and refusal to compromise helped shake up a complacent music industry and created space for new voices and perspectives. However, His unforgiving nature and inability to find middle ground also isolated him and contributed to the breakdown of his own band. Today, looking back at these conflicts, we can see them as part of the larger cultural upheaval of the 1970s, when established institutions and traditional authorities were being challenged across society. Rotten's musical feuds were one front in a broader war about values, authenticity, and the role of popular culture in social change. Whether his approach was ultimately constructive or destructive remains a matter of debate, but there's no question that Johnny Rotten's willingness to make enemies in defense of his principles helped reshape popular music and cultural criticism. His feuds with other musicians continue to resonate because they touched on fundamental questions about art, commerce, and authenticity that remain relevant in today's cultural landscape.